And welcome to today's workshop on harnessing resilience for future challenges. My name is Emily Stubbs. I'm Policy and Projects Manager at the Greater Birmingham Chambers of Commerce. And this event is part of our Growth Through People campaign. Growth Through People aims to help local firms boost productivity through improved leadership and people management skills. This year, it's involved a whole month of content throughout March. That involves webinars like this one, as well as a conference next week. And a whole host of digital content in the forms of blogs, podcasts, videos, and more. I'd like to give a huge thank you to all of our headline sponsors for their support of the campaign: Aston University, BMET College, and the University of Birmingham's Work Inclusivity Research Centre. I'd also like to give a huge thank you and introduce our speakers today. Firstly, we have Dr. Philip McCree, Chief Medical Officer at BHSF. Philip is an expert in occupational health and has 28 years of experience in working full-time in occupational health. Philip has been a consultant in occupational medicine to over 1,000 corporate clients and has an extensive experience in the management of mental health issues in the workplace, specifically stress-related illness. Philip has acted as an expert on stress in 168 industrial tribunals and court appearances, more than any other occupational health practitioner in the UK. We also have with us Nathan Wallace, Chief of Staff at Wesleyan. Nathan Wallace has over a decade of corporate communications and colleague engagement experience working across HR, media relations, and internal communications. He has experience in multiple industries, from financial services, public services, and the civil service. In his early career, Nathan moved from a technical financial role into PR and helped High Street Bank Halifax navigate a tricky media landscape following the 2008 financial crash. Since then, he's gained experience in a wider portfolio of roles, leading comms, strategy, engagement, culture, and corporate responsibility. He is now Chief of Staff for Specialist Financial Mutual Wesleyan, as well as a trustee for a multi-academy trust. A father of three with a keen interest in the education sector, Nathan has won awards for change management communications and is a recognised industry speaker. Before I hand over to Phil to begin today's session, we have two anonymous polls that my colleague Sophie is going to put on the screen now. I'd like to ask you to fill those out. Hopefully they'll spark some ideas for today's discussions, and crucially they'll feed into our research into leadership and people management across the region. While you're doing that, I'll mention it now and at the end of today's session. If you can spare 5 minutes to complete our post-event survey, it would be hugely appreciated. It's not just about this webinar, but also it will contribute to our research into leadership and people management across the region and our conversations with stakeholders on this agenda. It will also inform what Growth of People looks like going forward. And don't forget to join us on social media using the hashtag GTP21. Sophie, can we reveal the results of that poll, please? Hoping the technology works. Fantastic. So 60% believe your work output has increased during the COVID-19 pandemic, and 80% believe your overall sense of personal resilience has increased during the pandemic. That's very interesting and leads us fantastically onto today's session on harnessing resilience for future challenges. So without further ado, I hope you'll have some practical ideas to take away following this session, and I will now hand over to Dr. Philip McCree, Chief Medical Officer at BHSF, to talk about stress and dealing with this in the workplace. Stop sharing my slides. Over to you, Phil.
Thank you, Emily, and good morning to my co-presenter, Nathan, and good morning to all of the delegates. Thank you for taking the time to come and listen to people like me. Hopefully, we will add a little value to the subject matter. Resilience, yes, that's a very interesting word. And I wonder if I asked all of the delegates what their definition of resilience, would we get 20 different views on it? Because it's a difficult term, but I have sort of two descriptions of it. Resilience could be considered as the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties, so a recovery rate, or indeed it could be the ability to adapt well in the face of adversity. So recovery or adaptation are both recognized definitions of resilience. Now I'm going to hopefully share my screen and this will work effectively. And I'm going to discuss a little bit around what the problem is as I see it, and then proffer what I believe we need to consider as solutions. And solutions is a difficult one to evaluate, but I'm going to give some ideas on short-term, medium-term, and long-term solutions for the difficulties that we face in the UK. Let me set the picture in respect of the mental health position in the UK. Pre-pandemic, so before March 2020, 40% of all absenteeism in the United Kingdom was as a consequence of a mental health issue or mental health problem. 2 out of 5 people who were off work because of a mental health problem. In the UK at that stage, 150 mentally unwell children were turned away every day from an NHS mental health trust because they did not have the resources or capacity to treat these children. And because 75% of all mental health problems begin before the age of 18, those mentally unwell children of today are the mentally unwell adults of the future. And when you add into the mix that the average waiting time to see a consultant psychiatrist in the UK before the pandemic was 12 months, then it gives you a little picture about what the state of secondary mental health care in the UK was before the pandemic. And of course, in the last year, we've had the most unprecedented of events. But what impact has that had on mental health? Because the pandemic itself is now producing what we call 2 additional stressors. We have the stressor caused by social isolation and by restriction of events. So people are alone. A large part of the UK population could now be classified as a lone worker, which brings into play some risks in itself. So social isolation, restriction from activities has affected people's mental well-being. And we also have the anxiety surrounding fear of contracting the virus, fear of the mortalities associated. So there is an anxiety around contracting the virus. So those are 2 new but additional stressors that we are now dealing with in addition to the ones that we had before the pandemic. I attended a World Health Organization webinar on the 1st of April 2020, which was attended by 84 experts in mental health from around the globe. And uniformly, they predicted that post-pandemic, we would face a mental health epidemic. So there is almost a fear or a worry that coming down the tracks is something that we simply will not be able to deal with. And finally, going back to my first stat, which was the 40% of absenteeism, the Health and Safety Executive on the 4th of November 2020 produced a record of absenteeism in the UK through 2019 and into the end of 2020, and discovered that absence due to mental health problems in the UK has now risen to 55% from 40% a year ago. So that, I'm sorry to start the morning off in such a negative term, but that there are positivities coming. That sets a scene or a picture of what pre-pandemic existed and what we might face. Now, stress and mental health are often used as interchangeable terms. Stress is the most commonest term used in the UK today. And you might be interested to know that it's actually not a medical term. It's a lay term because it reflects a concept. And as I've often said to patients, you cannot suffer from a concept. You suffer from an illness. So stress is a lay term, but I'm going to use it today because people can associate it. People understand what it means. But can you define what it is? Now I'll give you a sort of a definition that I think is quite quirky, but works. I describe stress as the confusion occurring when the mind overrides the body's desire to choke the living daylights out of somebody. So it's that mental confusion and concern. There is a more professional definition, and it's classified as an adjustment reaction, which is defined as an adverse reaction to one or more unpleasant external stressors. So what are the causes of stress or mental health problems? A lot of causes. 6% of mental health illness in the UK is caused by what we call primary or endogenous clinical depression. That's depression caused from within endogenous, and that is the genetic predisposition or the family history of depression where there is a inherent susceptibility or vulnerability. So that's a chemical illness. And often that is the most difficult to treat because the people who are very depressed don't understand why. They may be in very successful careers with stable family backgrounds, and they feel terrible that they feel unwell, yet there's no reason for it. So often dealing with primary depression is very difficult. There is also a wide range of secondary depressive illnesses, which are caused by exogenous, external stressors. I've mentioned the two new ones, but we're all aware of the common life stressors that we face, which include redundancy, bereavement, moving house, relationship issues, and health concerns. Those are common and long-standing. What has changed in society today is our abilities to cope with these stressors and our responses to them. Because we now have placed upon ourselves the added burden in society today of being working parents, maybe looking after children and looking after elderly relatives. The reason for that is that gradually the social care structure in the UK has placed a responsibility on families to look after relatives. And of course, we're all living longer. So therefore, this is a new demand placed upon people's capacity. So you can see that with work, home, illness, pandemic, other situations, we increasingly face an added burden upon us. Now, how does it manifest? Well, we talk about what I call physical and psychological manifestations. The physical manifestations reflect, you may have heard of this, the fight or flight response. In other words, are in old days when we faced a stressor, the stock response was to fight, to stand up and defend, or to run away. And our metabolism and our chemical system prepares it for that. So it secretes chemicals and hormones that increase our heart rate. It actually increases our blood pressure. We may start to sweat, etc. It gets us prepared for action. Of course, in the modern workplace, if your manager challenges you, headbutting your manager in the office is not a great response for your career prospects. Conversely, opening the door and running out of the building and avoiding the conversation is equally not a good response. But believe it or not, both of those things have happened, and I've dealt with them professionally. So the fight or flight response is still a very real one today. Psychologically, we develop agitation, sleep disturbance, emotional ability, mood swings, and isolation. For example, last week, a customer rang me to say they were concerned about one of their long-standing employees because he had taken over the last 6 weeks. Instead of joining his comrades in the canteen at lunchtime, he was going to sit on his own in the car park. And that is a classic red flag sign for clinical depression, somebody whose behavior changes to an extreme isolation. So those are the manifestations. I think in medicine, it's important that I always say to everybody, we need to separate out people who are ill from people who are overwhelmed, because the management of the two categories is completely different. We mustn't medicalize a situation where somebody needs pragmatic support and guidance. Conversely, we also need to separate out those who are ill from those who think they're ill, because it's important that we assist and manage people appropriately. So my colleague Nathan will talk about a case study in Wesleyan about managing this, but coping strategies is a very significant inherent strength that we might add. Everybody boils at different temperatures, and you may well know, if you've attended a family funeral, there is always usually one member of the family who takes ownership of the situation because they probably are the most naturally resilient. But if you're not naturally resilient, you can improve your capacity through various techniques to deal with situations. And indeed, for those of you who have come across cognitive behavioral therapy, it is now approved by the National Institute of Clinical Excellence as the most effective therapeutic medium for mild to moderate depression and anxiety. Cognitive behavioral therapy revolves around teaching people not to react so extremely to stressors, not to become catastrophic in their responses, or not to be disabled by them. So it's a way of coping more effectively with what you face. And there are a number of measures that are offered to help people do that. The impact of stress or mental health issues in the workplace revolves around issues with attendance, so absenteeism, either short-term or long-term, or a combination of both, or performance issues. And this is a classic one because if we take clinical depression, which affects 6% of the UK population, it's a very insidious illness. It's not unusual for me. And in fact, Emily gave me a very good introduction to my career. I worked out last night that I've seen over 120,000 people in the consulting room in my professional career. Around 60% of those would be mental health. That's about 70,000 people. So it's not actually unusual to, and I practice an open reflective consultation style. So when I see somebody with clinical depression, interestingly, I often have them diagnosed before they open their mouth, because when they walk in through the consulting room, the way they walk, the way they avoid eye contact, the way they sit in the chair, I'm starting to write down endogenous depression before I say good morning or good afternoon, hello, because the evidence before you visually is so powerful. But when you're talking to patients and you ask them, when did your symptoms begin? It's not unusual for them to say, it's about 18 months, 2 years, 5 years. I've had people in their 30s saying, I've never felt well. So depression is a very insidious illness. Now, key aspects of clinical depression is the guilt. I talked earlier about the individual who had primary depression, who felt, I have nothing to be depressed about, I have a wonderful life. That accentuates the guilt that they feel. So people who've got clinical depression will feel guilty. They will feel guilty about letting the team down. They will feel guilty about being off work. They will feel guilty about their prospects, promotion and development. They will also feel ashamed or embarrassed. And that's why if you ever, as a motivated manager, say to somebody whom you are worried about, who you think has got depression, Phil, are you okay? The answer you will get is, I'm fine. And a psychiatrist in London said to me, Phil, fine means effed up, insecure, neurotic, and emotional. That's fine, because people will not divulge this type of information to you. So this is a common scene, trust me. So you have an individual with clinical depression who is struggling to come to work. They are battling against all the odds to come into work, but they're not performing very well because they're not well. And the manager, who's motivated and supportive, doesn't really know what to do. Any introductory conversations have resulted in a rebuff or a pushback, which is common. So they come to the annual performance review, where the manager says, I'm terribly sorry, Phil, but your performance this year hasn't just been the normal. You've missed a lot of deadlines. The quality of your work isn't so good. So I'm going to have to mark you down a grade from a 3 to a 2 or a 3 to a 4, whichever is the system. And that, believe you not, often acts as the catalyst for an absolute volcanic eruption. Because from the individual's viewpoint, they think, I have battled relentlessly this year to come to work in the face of an increasing mental health problem. And my gratitude from you for this is a downgrade, which will have an impact on pay or on promotion. And that usually results quite often in a volcanic eruption, an outburst, and a protracted period of absence. I've seen many people in this scenario who never return to work for that employer. And the sad thing about all of this, it's completely preventable. So how do we prevent it? Okay, I'm going to talk about a sort of short-term, medium-term, and long-term program. I don't like to use the word treatment, because this is about a number of measures to address what is becoming an increasing problem. Early intervention. Well, what do I mean by that? Early intervention is actually getting involved in the management of absence at the earliest possible stage. And in mental health issues, I would suggest first day. So as soon as you become aware that a colleague is off work because they are mentally unwell, intervene. So why should you intervene? Well, first of all, when somebody's off work, the process of institutionalization begins 6 weeks after they stop work. So if you're out of work 3 months, only 50% of people will go back to that job. If it's 6 months, 15% go back. And after a year, less than 5%. So the longer you're off work, the harder it is to go back. And the obstacles to getting back to work are not the obstacles that stopped you going to work in the first place. So early intervention will help you get somebody back to work and well again more effectively and quickly. Fine. So, and rather than reacting, I think we need to become proactive and manage this more effectively. Now, my aspiration for organizations is for organizations to develop a presenteeism policy. Presenteeism is defined as being present at work, but not performing well. In other words, quite often these are people who struggle with health problems, but are attending work every day. And a lot of employers in the UK find this most difficult to deal with because they have an absence policy, but if somebody's at work, they don't have a presenteeism policy. And I've spent the last 10 years of my professional life trying to persuade employers to introduce a presenteeism policy. And sadly, I have failed miserably because I understand it's almost like a step too far. So one of the things I'm going to suggest is that you consider a training program, because I'm in the process of working with the Institute of Apprenticeships of developing an apprenticeship program which will effectively train mental health champions. Now, this is not the same as a mental health first aider, and I know many of you in this call may have access to mental health first aid in your workplace, but mental health first aid is a very good idea, but has probably been established in isolation, and that itself is causing problems. I am now seeing in my clinic rooms mental health first aiders who are off work because of mental health problems, because they are becoming beleaguered with colleagues in the workforce coming to them as the expert in mental health to deal with their problems. And quite simply, they aren't trained or qualified to deal with the information they're receiving. So I think mental health first aid as part of a overall training program is fantastic, but not on its own. So I am working with the Institute of Apprenticeship to try and bring to the market a 12-month training program that would train individuals in the regulatory compliance around the law, the ability to do stress at work risk assessment, the ability to become a counsellor with a small c, have those initial difficult conversations, have those being able to support managers in HR, recognize the signs and symptoms, be able to signpost appropriately to resources to deal with it. In other words, be the lay qualified person in the workplace who can coordinate action at the earliest possible stage, almost like the support mechanism from within. And you know what? When I was talking about this the other day to somebody, they said, that sounds, Phil, like a welfare officer. And you know what? They could be right, because in the old days, and many of you probably aren't old enough to remember this, I used to work in organizations who had welfare officers, and they had a pastoral role. So in some respects, it's almost like bringing back that pastoral role for people to support them. The key aspect being, let's deal with people before they become too ill to manage. And finally, on a long-term basis, I believe organizations need to consider cultural change, changing the way the business operates and focuses. So instead of, unfortunately, as some organizations do, treat people with mental health issues as problems or tiptoe around them, or, I would encourage organizations to embrace this at board level. And in BHSF, in 2019, my colleague, the HR director, became seriously mentally unwell and was in a very dark place. And we managed to treat him get him dealt with really early, because, I suppose in some respects he was lucky that I was his colleague, and in other respects he was unlucky that I was his colleague, because I never left him alone. But we got him treated, stabilized, and well again. And what he did was he told his story in a intranet video, and we put it on for the staff. We have 350 staff. We put it on for all the staff to consider, because here was a senior member of the executive telling everybody, I've been mentally unwell and it's okay to be mentally unwell. And would you believe it? 9 people came forward to see me as a consequence of his video. In other words, they felt empowered to come forward and discuss it because somebody at the top table had it. So the power that we have at the top table, if we support this program, is immense. And that includes looking at all the policies and procedures to see what impact they have, and also looking at the support mechanisms we have. I mean, EAPs, employee assistance programs, are very useful if you need counselling, but they're not very good if you don't need counselling. And unfortunately, most standard EAPs today no longer can meet the needs of complex mental health problems in the UK. So I would suggest that organisations review the provisions of their EAP to have it, as it were, fit for purpose for the future, and indeed to offer the staff developmental opportunities as well. So those are cultural changes. But more importantly, and going back to my apprenticeship or the mental health first aider, we've got to support the development and training of managers, because they're going to be the first people who recognize or visualize their colleagues with issues. The call I had from the customer last week about the employee who was sitting in the car, that had been spotted by the line manager who was concerned about it. So training managers compassionately in how to support their staff is important, and don't let's assume they can do it naturally. We need to address the issues around discrimination and supporting disclosure. The Mental Health at Work survey in 2018 found in the UK that 11% of people who disclosed a mental health problem to their employer faced discrimination, dismissal, or demotion as a consequence of their disclosure. So that's only 2 years ago, and that is a significant level. So, supporting disclosure, making it okay to not be okay, because if we have 70% of your absence as a result of mental health problems, that's a lot of people. And bring the diversity of lived experience, because somebody who's been through a mental health problem and recovered has a unique experience and transferable skill, because they can sit with somebody and say, I know what you're going through. This is what I did. That's a very, very, very powerful experience, and it should be valued as opposed to being excluded. We've a long way to go, but what I believe is that if organizations, first of all, realize the problem, accept that it's going to occur, and then consider a composite set of measures, both early, medium, and long term, then as a grouping, we can actually deal with this problem effectively. If we don't, we're simply going to face a catastrophe, and it's going to be a very difficult scenario for everybody. Thank you for listening today.
Thank you ever so much, Phil. I think that was incredibly insightful and really useful to hear the sort of clinical perspective. We were talking about this before we went live, but I feel like often you don't hear that clinical perspective unless you've got to that point of crisis. I think it's really useful to hear that sort of before that and be able to prevent. If you have any questions for Phil, please do put them in the Q&A. I have a few to kick off with, but we'll take audience questions as well, of course. Phil, sort of the first question I have for you, you'd obviously spoke about the importance of managers and the importance of spotting sort of red flags, as you put it, in terms of behavioural change, and particularly when it comes to clinical depression. But the polls at the beginning, obviously, people were talking about 60% of people believe their output has increased over the last year. Equally, 80% believe their resilience has increased. But sort of particularly a year into the pandemic, a lot of people, key workers in particular, have obviously had a very stressful and very busy and sort of, high adrenaline almost year. How how do you spot signs of burnout among that, particularly when we're all apart?
Yes, that's a very good point, because the lone working syndrome, or remote working, Emily, is a very effective way of hiding or disguising the situation, because often your interaction with people is in short bursts rather than throughout a day. I think this is where I mean, going back to my original comments, where people are reluctant to come forward. I mean, I appreciate in this poll of participants, the resilience, the view has been increased. In BHSF, we're seeing 1,000 people a week with mental health problems sitting in front of our clinics across the UK. 1,000 people per week. There's a lot out there. I think what I say to all, and we do this ourselves in our own business, the frequency of contact is immense. We have so much contact with our staff, and we do it in formal and informal ways. So there are team meetings, there are groupings, there are business meetings, but we have coffee mornings, virtual coffee mornings. We have virtual afternoon tea. We have little social events in the evening. This is all about bringing people into interaction, into making them feel part of a team, even though they may be in a very, very isolated position, and making them feel belonged, or belonging, and included. And I think you have got to just work overtime. I mean, it's funny. Sometimes you can't win, because I remember two cases. When I worked for British Telecom many years ago, they had a corporate policy that the manager contacted you every day that you were off work. It was a daily phone call in those days. And you know, I saw a gentleman in the consulting room who said, they're harassing me. They never leave me alone. They're ringing me every day. And, you know, and that was one extreme. And conversely, I saw a gentleman who had been off work for a number of weeks following a heart attack. He had 25 years service. And he sat in the consulting room, said, I haven't heard from anybody. No, nobody's been in touch with me. And he felt really, really upset about that. Nobody cares. When I contacted the company, they said, he's a magnificent employee. We're leaving him alone because we know he's not well. So it's all about perceptions, Emily. You know, and I think it's about having that mix of work and social interaction. I think keeps people engaged and keep people's involved. I mean, the furlough scheme has created another issue, because those people who are on furlough, and we've had some staff who've been on furlough, after a while they start to worry about, well, nobody seems to need me anymore. They can do without me. And then they fear about their job security. And we have reassured everybody. BHSF, we're not for profit. We've paid everybody 100% of pay for the entire time they've been on furlough, and we have reassured them that everybody's job is secure to take away those insecurities. But that's another aspect of it. So this is all about the way you communicate, you engage and interact, and make people belong to the organization. And I think you've just got to work so hard at it. I mean, we make in my business, we make every month 5 random well-being calls. We get a list of people. They don't even work with me, but we just phone them up and say hello. And you're not allowed to talk about work. You just phone them up and say hello. Tell me who you are, what you do, how are you? Just five calls, 10 minutes each, once a month. And the staff absolutely love that. They just think it's nice to get a phone call. So it's just about doing things that people believe have an impact. And of course, then you need to do your feedback surveys to see, is this a waste of time or not? So I think you've just got to work so hard at it, because it's easy to leave people alone.
Definitely. I think those are very good examples of things which I think just keep people engaged throughout the sort of chaos of the last year. Do you think, I mean, this is a very broad question, a very general question, but do you think we've done enough sort of as a society? I think mental health has become increasingly a part of conversations over the last sort of 5 to 10 years. Do you think we're at a point yet where those stigmas are sort of diminished, or certainly, you know, those stigmas are a sort of minority of cases, and most people feel comfortable accepting that, you know, mental illness is illness? Or do you think there's more to be tackled there?
let me give you an example. Absolutely not are the two words I would say, Emily, but let me give you an example. And this is absolutely true and live. I do some work with an organization called Clear Talents, who support people with disabilities in employment and in reasonable adjustments and things like that. A very commendable organization. And they said to me, because I asked them exactly the same question, did you think that in UK society we had progressed? And they said last year, so 2019, we got 20 people to apply to join a large corporate employer, very well known, who were advertising and recruiting. And they applied for 20 positions within the corporate employer. And in application forms, most employers will ask one question: do you think you have a condition that is recognized under the Equality Act, or do you think you have a condition that would merit classification as a disability, yes or no? And if you tick yes, it asks you for some more information. So those 20 people ticked no. And the same 20 people reapplied, changing some of the details to obviously not make it obvious that they were the same people for the same jobs, only they ticked yes to the equality disability question. All 20 of the people who ticked no got an interview. None of the 20 who ticked yes got an interview. Does that answer your question, Emily?
That most definitely answers my question. That's shocking. Obviously, I don't want to ask anything about that specific company. Do you think certain sectors are dealing with mental health in the workplace better than others?
I think the answer to that is probably yes, but it would be disingenuous of me to say who they were because I don't know. I think that my experience has been that if you have a chief executive or an HR director or a manager or somebody who is personally very motivated, maybe because they have a family member who's mental health illness, or maybe they've had it themselves, then they tend to drive that agenda very proactively. Conversely, the other end of the scale is that you have quite a lot of people who simply don't understand it. People today still think if you have a mental health illness, you're mad. I mean, I've had the term bonkers. So-and-so, we want you to see this member of staff who's off his rocker, quote unquote. So there is still a perception that mental health illness is dangerous, or in some way you're going to be, people don't want to be in a room alone with people because they fear some sort of violent outburst or things like that. There is a very deep-seated fear of mental health, Emily. And I think we're a long way of changing, or long way off changing that. I think this is the process of change that will take decades. But I think, our starting point, I think, is to acknowledge and recognize that we're going to have every delegate who attends today is going to have some of their colleagues will experience this. What do we do about it? When do we intervene? And what are the options? So I think this is about education, offering the solutions so people can engage. And once people see the results of that engagement and how effective they are and how conscientious and loyal and grateful the employees are, then they start to realize this is worth doing rather than avoidance, because it's easy to avoid, it's difficult to intervene. But I often say the cost of intervention is far less than the cost of non-intervention.
That leads perfectly onto my next question, which was just going to be resources, obviously, and cash flow in particular are very tight for a lot of businesses right now. What sort of long-term interventions, and I mean beyond the sort of short-term interventions that you highlighted of identifying people who are ill and making sure that they're receiving treatment, but those long-term interventions when it comes to prevention, what long-term interventions might maybe be prioritized to start with, or might be low cost to set up that you might recommend?
Well, the long-term interventions I mentioned don't really cost very much, Emily, because it's all about a commitment. It's all about demonstrating a commitment, and it's all about bringing in some basic awareness training That's where we start with. We say to people, bring in some awareness training, make it okay to not be okay. That doesn't cost much money. It really doesn't. You don't, it's not a massive capital expenditure project. This is small amounts of money, and treating people. I mean, the cost of a day's absence in the UK varies between 141 and 168 pounds. So the cost of treating somebody with a mental health problem is less than 1 week's absence. It's absolutely a no-brainer. This is not about spending money. This is about investing to save money. But more importantly than that, to look after your staff. The qualitative benefits are immeasurable, absolutely immeasurable. So no, this is not about spending lots of money. You don't have to. You just have to be very astute in the measures you take to have the impact. It's not about spending lots of money. Throwing lots of money at a problem is never a solution. You've got to identify what the problem is and then work through it. And I mean, the long-term measures, by virtue of the fact that they're long-term, Emily, take time to implement, but they don't take a lot of money. In fact, I would suggest many of those can be done at nil charge to the business.
Fantastic. I'm sure that's very useful for those listening. And I'm conscious that we're probably about to move on to Nathan, who'll be talking about the practical sort of interventions that they've done at Wesleyan, and hopefully there are some good ideas for those listening. How sort of, I suppose, how can businesses who, I mean, I suppose you mentioned some examples already, key workers, HR individuals, managers who perhaps have been sort of particularly under pressure throughout the last 12 months. How can we sort of focus and make sure that even if, we don't know when COVID's going to end, we don't know when that pressure is going to end, how can businesses support those teams that are potentially in danger of burnout and sort of work-related mental health illnesses as a result of that pressure?
And what a difficult question that is, Emily, I have to say. But I mean, in addition to all of the standard contact and intervention, if I was going to suggest one key learning point or takeaway point, review the provisions of your employee assistance program, because I suggest they probably don't cover what you need, and enhance them, and then re-engage with your employees to make them aware that they have access to them. In BHSF, we have been very mindful of our staff, and we have opened up access to a full suite of mental health support resources to all of our staff. They can access them at any time. And that is all types of structured therapy, psychological assessment, even a psychiatric appointment. We've offered the complete gambit of clinical resources and indeed non-clinical. So our staff, if they need legal advice, if they need debt management advice, addiction support, care or special needs advice, because we've many staff who have got special needs children at home, elderly relatives, are worried about what they do. So we offer those pragmatic solutions as well. And all of our staff have access to all of those at any time. We have made that available, and we have paid for that for our staff and engaged with them so that they know if they reach a difficulty, they have access to professionals who can help them. So I would say review your EAP. I would probably suggest it's not going to cover what you need. Enhance it, engage with your employees, and then you've got that support, professional support mechanism in the background when somebody reaches a stage when it becomes a crisis. Because the problem then, unfortunately, is everybody drops everything and runs around in a crazy state to try and deal with it, and that's hugely ineffectual.
That's a really important point, actually, that as a manager or a leader, if someone's experiencing a mental health difficulty and it's actually related to, like you say, debt management, addiction, external sort of non-business related stressors, know what you don't know, and know that there are it's experienced professionals out there who are going to be able to provide the best advice and know to signpost to theirs.
Could I tell a very brief story about a patient who changed my life? In fact, a patient who galvanized our mental health program, which I set up a year ago. I saw a 43-year-old man who was in a very distressed state in front of me in the consultation room, and the employer had sent him to me with one question: when will this gentleman be fit to return to work? And as I got him to compose himself, he told me that he was the primary carer for his bedridden wife with multiple sclerosis. His 16-year-old autistic son, unable to cope with his mother's illness, was essentially becoming violent, aggressive, and wrecking the house. And his 82-year-old mother, 3 times a week, was escaping from the home and wandering the streets, and he was being summoned by the police to come and take her back to the home. He was the only sibling who lived within 200 miles of her, so he was on his own. And as I sat listening to this man, I thought 2 things. First of all, I can't fix this man because it's not a medical problem. I can't give him medication to change his scenario. He's in this impossible situation of demand. And the second point I thought was, I'm actually going to make his awful situation worse, because as a consequence of my report, which is going to tell his employer that he's not well enough to go back to work at this point in time, and realistically for the foreseeable future, it was highly probable that they would terminate his contract. So I would add financial insecurity to his already deepening woes. So I reflected upon that man and thought, what is my purpose here? What am I actually doing? I'm actually going to make a man in an awful situation much worse. So that galvanized me into developing the mental health program that I've referenced a bit today, about the 360 degrees of treating the person as a whole, but making sure you've access to everything they need. In this case, this man needed pragmatic social support. He needed to be able to work from home, to do all of these things that at that stage weren't available. So, it's about getting involved in supporting and going the extra mile, Emily, going that little bit of extra mile to look after somebody, because you'll get it back in spades. You absolutely will get it back in spades. So I think, every doctor will be able to tell you the patient that changed their life. That was the one who changed mine. And as a result of it, we have the BHSF mental health program. So hopefully that answered your question.
That's an incredible story. Thank you, Phil. Fantastic. So please do continue. Please do put your questions in the Q&A if you have any for Phil or for Nathan. I'm now going to hand over to Nathan Wallace, who is Chief of Staff at Wesleyan. Nathan's going to be talking about how Wesleyan are harnessing resilience for future challenges. Over to you, Nathan.
Thanks, Emily, and thank you, Phil. As a career-long communicator that has broadened into other things, I think we've just seen from Phil what I preach about the value of storytelling. I think it's really, really critical as leaders and as humans to tell our story and things we've learned along the way. So in that ilk, rather than jumping straight into my slides, I think I'll just start with a little bit of a story. And my story starts in terms of my position on resilience and its value in the workplace, and the fact that, without wishing to dismiss many of the clinical and difficult things we've heard from Phil, that for the vast majority of an employee base, you're able to sort of help develop and grow colleagues to deal with resilience, particularly in the workplace, for future enhancements to the business. And I think the poll at the start of this session demonstrated that, with the 25 of us here saying that their resilience has grown over this period, because inevitably it's had to. Otherwise, we would have been, I'm sure, in a darker place. So mine starts at the start of my career. I did 2 years on a graduate scheme for a high street bank at the time. And I was just finding my feet in the world of work. And I decided that I wasn't quite in the right place. I was enjoying what I was doing, but not enough to build a career around it. And so a job came up in the press office that I wasn't qualified for, but I felt I was a good writer. I was passionate about the things that we were doing, and I wanted to tell that story to the outside world. And so I joined the press office, only, as I say, 2 years into my career. And then within a handful of months, we were in the throes of the 2008 global financial crash. The bank which I had worked the last 2 years for was, at the centre of the storm, a major high street lender, and much of this was caused around lending. We were national news day and night. We were television, radio. The story around what was going on in the financial services industry was huge. And I found myself coming, what didn't feel like out of university kind of a couple of days ago, albeit it was a few years, to working every hour God sent in a high pressure environment. Once we'd left the office, we were back to watch the 6 o'clock news, the 10 o'clock news, to see what was being said about our industry and about our customers and everything that was going on. And it was relentless, utterly relentless. And I was exhausted. I didn't know if I was doing a good job. I didn't know what was going on. And from my perspective, this was my first real test in terms of workplace resilience. The detail of how it went and what transpired was separate. But the thing I wanted to add was, at the same time, I was trying to buy my first house. And I was in, the throes of a relationship with my now wife. And even though things at work can deem to be manageable, when you add them onto other things that are going on in people's lives, like Phil has just described, it doesn't take a very resilient person long to potentially find themselves in a position of difficulty. And so whilst I go through the examples of Wesleyan, my call out would be, even if your business is stable, even if jobs are secure, and even if workload has decreased based on the poll we saw earlier, there may be things going on in people's lives, normally trivial, but they could be the straw that broke the camel's back, which is why the point Phil made about management intervention is the biggest thing I would like to get across from today. Managers are the source and potentially the cure to the majority of workplace challenges. They can spot them, they can intervene, they can reprioritize, they can offer support, they can refer to other areas of support. It is absolutely vital. So all of the things Wesleyan have put in place, they've had an impact, a positive impact. But I'm now talking to my executive colleagues on a weekly basis about what we can get our leaders to do better and different that will help with this. So on that basis, I'll jump into sort of what I was hoping to share today. Emily, give me a nod if you can see that. All good, right. So I don't have the credentials or the letters after my name that Phil does to warrant this slot. I'm just someone who's passionate about it and has spent a good few years trying to help in the workplace around employee engagement and well-being. So I wanted to start with the top 5. That was the thing I was always taught, right? Start with a list. That always helps. And so, how do I move on? What's going on here? There we go. Right. So my top 5 for helping build resilience for future challenges. Firstly, I wanted to call out, put an appropriate framework in place for your business. And I've said appropriate because, I've sat on a number of these talks where people talk about the things they've done, and you sort of sit there and go, I can't do that. We can't afford that, or that wouldn't work for our business. And you immediately feel a little bit downtrodden and, well, we're never going to get to where they are. The key learned from me over the years was, whatever works for your employees and whatever you can afford will be appropriate for your teams. You've got to just do what works for you. So take the best of what you've heard and what you can apply and do your best with that. Don't strive for things that don't work for your company. As I say, as a lifelong communicator, career-long communicator, number 2 is critical to me. You want a 2-way communication process. So this is about you being able to communicate what's going on in the business or your intentions, or re-communicate your EAP as Phil suggested, but you need to make sure that's a 2-way dialogue. It's cascade and converse, as I call our model within Wesleyan. You share information, but you discuss it and you have a 2-way dialogue. And that's not just about face-to-face conversations, that's anonymous surveys, that's feedback polls, that's whatever you can get to give you the information to make the best difference that you can. And number 3, I think, is really relevant for those of us that have a role in terms of the business success as well as those of the individuals we're looking after. If you take a spectrum of care and commerciality, right, they're not mutually exclusive and they're not necessarily entirely correlated. However, at one end of the spectrum, you could put every pound and minute you can into looking after your people, but then you may not look after your customers, and you may not turn a profit, and you may not then have a sustainable business. The other end of it is you focus purely on, profit, customer outcomes, and forget about your people, and they fall over. You don't then have the team to deliver the service, and therefore everyone loses, right? So therefore, there has to be a right spot on this spectrum for you and your business that everyone has to get right. And that's not a spot that sticks. That's a spot that can move depending on what's going on. So I would say at Wesleyan, we've always had a culture of care, but our business, was impacted financially by the pandemic, and we want to make sure that we are sustainable for our members for the future. And so we've sought to move towards commerciality, despite the difficulties that are going on. We know that's in the best interest of everyone in the long term. However, we have to balance what that does to our people, how far we push them, what we're asking of them, and make sure that doesn't cause unintended consequences. And that's all about that communication, taking people on a journey, depending on what you feel your business needs to do in order to recover from the pandemic. Critical to invest in learning and development. Again, invest could be pounds, but it could just be time. It's about having people like Phil or others that are willing to come and speak to your people, to give them the information they need to make the most of it. And as I say, if you can have a full training suite, that's fantastic. If you can't, it's about sharing videos like this, any free materials online, tapping into the Chamber's work that it's already doing. It's all there for us to use. So I would invest the time in helping your people, because this can be trained and it can be learned in some areas. Now, point 5 is linked to training and development, but is something that Wesleyan have been working on for a number of months, and I wanted to call it out. Psychological safety. Now, there's a number of definitions for that, but ultimately the one I've called out, because I think it resonates most, is it's a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes, right? This applies to a multitude of sins. This could be business issues, this could be business as usual, this could be feelings of stress or wanting to talk about how they're feeling. If you're in a psychologically safe team, you take away all of the negative inference and the concern and the worry about speaking up, and you replace it with a feeling of belonging and a feeling of safety and a feeling of care. And to do so, you just need to work through with your employees what sort of environment they can work within and how they can share. And you need people on both sides of that conversation to be open to the outcomes. And I don't want to try and solve that today, but I would encourage you, if it's not something that you're aware of or have looked at before, to do a bit of research after this, because I personally, a part of Wesleyan's group executive, we have brought in some external support to build us as a new team to try and drive business outcomes. And they've brought psychological safety to us, and I have to say it's been marvelous, and the relationships I've built are fantastic and stand us in good stead to achieve. So that would be my top 5. Now, if I reflect on Wesleyan as a case study, I would like to start by saying I feel very lucky that our people are seemingly in a good place, and I think we've managed it relatively well. But this slide alone will tell you that there are still problems, and we're not immune to it, despite the things we put into it. So stress and anxiety are the top 2 reasons for sickness absence. And as a life insurer, we've also seen the same sort of critical illness protection cover we offer. We've seen the same in our customer base. Stress and anxiety long took over musculoskeletal as the main reasons for absence and issue for customers and colleagues alike. We found that the number of employees being off sick over the last 12 months has decreased, but the time in which they are off has increased, which has shown this additional stress and anxiety is taking people longer to recover, longer out of the workplace compared to previous conditions that we saw. Phil talked about EAP, and I've now got a note here to go and review it and make sure that it does deliver what we want it to deliver. But the calls to that are up 45% over the last sort of 12 months. And that's not just work related. I think the point I made earlier, we're seeing calls about divorce, legal issues, all that sort of thing as well, because this has placed an additional stress on people outside of the working day. But of course, work plays a big part in people's lives. Our sickness level is low, luckily, below industry average, but we're also seeing a presenteeism issue potentially as a nation, where people aren't reporting whether they're ill with other things, or shall I say non-pandemic, non-stress things, because they're just at home and they're managing them accordingly. Excuse me. It doesn't mean that's gone away, and it doesn't mean people aren't still suffering with other things. It just means they're not telling us about them, and that's not great for helping manage that situation. One of the major benefits of the effort we've put into talking about mental health over the last 18 months is that people are now talking about mental health. I'm incredibly proud of the fact that the however many people that put null, as our system allows them to when they declare their illness, whether we give them an option not to share, which is, I think, only fair, the number of people that have used null have decreased 93%. And that's then correlated with our increase in stress and anxiety. So people are feeling able to tell us why they're off. And I think that is fantastic. And it's a real step in the right direction for helping with these challenges. And of course, work-life balance has been a major issue for us as we try to transform our business, but also people have had to homeschool, they've had to self-isolate, they've had to deal with family members who've been poorly. You know, that balance, not quite as severe as Phil's explanation, but that balance is significantly difficult and harder at the moment, on top of a lowered resilience of 12 months of working in this way. So that's our sort of position on that front. However, the positive for Wesleyan is whatever we're doing is working. My manager cares about me as a person. This is out of 10, by the way, up over the last year. Wesleyan cares about my well-being, up. We're responding appropriate to pandemic, up. Regular and helpful communication, up. And the equipment I need to work from home for a long period of time, up. So the interventions we've made have helped our people, and they're telling us that. And I'm very, very proud of the scores as well. Clearly, it's not right in every corner. I don't profess to have all the answers, but I just wanted to share why I think our case study will hopefully be useful to some of you today. So talking about framework, this is our framework. It's Be Well at Wesleyan. And we have a number of categories under that looks to sort of broadly serve the wider well-being, mental health type agenda. Clearly, I won't run through all the bullet points, but you can see here you've got be healthy, and that's the things that we offer to our colleagues to try and improve their health. So we've got well-being hub, flu vaccinations, private medical insurance for certain grades. We offer GP online consultations, etc. Be Mindful is our focus on mental health, and we have a suite of first aiders, the EAP. We've got space in our head office for people to go and have either time to themselves or indeed with a mental health first aider. We've got training in place for managers and for colleagues. And we've got network groups across all of our sort of inclusion and diversity work. We have network groups, and one of those is a mental health network too. Be balanced, be financially secure, be connected, be giving. You know, these are all things that we think round off a well-being agenda, because if someone is volunteering, you get a sense of self-worth. If someone is financially secure, you take away one of the worries outside of work. And clearly we're encouraging people to take time for themselves via holiday, particularly at the moment, which, as I'm sure your businesses are seeing, I think people are holding off towards the end of the year when we hopefully might be able to go away, albeit the news last 48 hours suggests otherwise. But that's got the potential to cause 9 months of pain for people not taking breaks before Q4. It's also going to cause you a real headache in Q4 when everyone disappears and there's no one left to serve your customers. This is that care and commerciality balance we were talking about. So you've got to get the right balance and encourage people to still take lead. So that's our framework. One of the things I wanted to share was just some of the practical things that we've done. And I think a case study is only useful if you can really get a sense. So we were very rigid with the COVID rules, and we, like everyone else, observed the lockdown. However, we had a skeleton staff in the office to allow certain colleagues to come in and hot desk at a distance to recognize potential issues at home, whether that's needing to change their scenery, whether that's victims of domestic abuse. We gave colleagues a very clear steer that if they needed to be in, we would make it work safely. And that's something we've done throughout. as I've mentioned, seeing a GP in the early stage of the pandemic, at least, was difficult. People were scared of going into those medical environments. And so we offered online virtual GP appointments, which have been a huge success. And I myself have used one of those for a back issue I suffered during that time, and it's been really, really useful. Talking about that communicate and cascade type piece, we've got Workplace by Facebook. Others may know Yammer, Slack, other things like that. We have a social network internally, and that has really lit up over the last 12 months. All these pictures here are pictures shared by colleagues on that network, and we've been sharing live fitness classes, yoga. We've had people on like Phil talking about stress and mental health, but we've also used it for business purposes, as you'd expect, and mixing the two together help people find that balance. I've talked about the seminars. We've done the training. The Wesleyan Wellbeing Hub was a later thing, and actually something that, if you have a small budget but aren't sure how to use it, is not a bad place to start. There's multiple on the market, but trying to set this up yourself from scratch is not necessary. Companies have these sort of products on the shelf. You send them your email addresses across, and immediately colleagues have got access to sleep, fitness, meditation, support, counseling, whatever it might be. There's tons in there. And so, happy to share outside of the session what we've used, but we set that up specifically this year to deal with the problems that we've had. And I've been really pleased by the uptake. We've continued to promote volunteering. We give colleagues 2 days a year to volunteer on top of annual leave. And as you'd expect, early doors, that dried up. People were no longer able to visit the local hospital, the dog's home, whatever it was they were doing. And so we've signed a deal recently with an online volunteering service that pair up people, business people, with charities and groups that need help. So I myself have been on to help with the communications and marketing plan. Someone else has been on to help with, an end of year financial results challenge. There's stuff that people can still do to add worth to their communities, which is really core to our culture. The other thing we did was get colleagues involved. People are isolated, people are working from home. And so we've set up a number of things. And I would say a lot of this is not pandemic related. This will continue long beyond. We've got people doing things together, fitness challenges. We did a 179th birthday celebration where we had people baking cakes and offered prizes. And we had kids do a colouring competition over Easter, which got families involved as well. And I think it's just really important to recognise the isolation and the disconnect from work. So that's been really important too. And then I suppose finally, before I seek to wrap, we've increased the frequency of our employee surveys. I mean, if I'm honest, I would do them more often than quarterly, but you've got to find the balance between people's survey fatigue. But any good business measures its finances at least monthly, if not weekly, if not daily. They do the same with other business metrics. Why has it been okay for so many years to just find out how your colleagues are once a year on a survey? I think that practice is long dated. So if you've got a two-way dialogue, that helps. If you can offer an anonymous survey, albeit you can do it via SurveyMonkey, or there are more professional providers out there to get some anonymous data, you might find the richness is there as well. So that's it in terms of the what we've done. By way of summary, linking back to the title of the seminar, future challenges for all of our working careers are going to be different to anyone that's gone prior. The problems that the last 12 months has caused will have a knock-on impact for many years to come. And that will be a knock-on impact in terms of people's well-being. It will be the challenges and fairness of getting back to the office. People will start to suffer from commuting fatigue. People will start to feel that their well-being is reduced because they're now spending an hour or two on the train or in the car. Financially, a number of our businesses, I'm sure, have been hit by what's happened. That will take some time to recover. You've then got the risk of losing talent when the employee market comes back. There are a long list of things we need to look out for as leaders in our businesses that no one has prior, because the circumstance is different. So there's no rule book. Be kind to yourselves. But the main learn here is try to develop your people, try to communicate with your people, try to give them the greatest experience they can without shielding them from challenge, because that's how people grow. But also do your best to put a framework in place that gives people somewhere to go if you, the employer, can't solve it, or if the problems are beyond work. Because as I started off my session with, there are lots of things going on in people's world they just need some help and advice with, and we can't always do that. So whether that's Phil's advice, my advice, or just generally what you've got, I wish you all the best of luck, and both of us would be happy to take any questions on what you've heard today. Thanks, Emily.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much, Nathan. Do you want to stop sharing your... There we go. Perfect. Thank you. Just to sort of start off with a question, and please do, those of you watching, please do put your questions in the Q&A function. Phil mentioned, and you touched on, Nathan, the power of leading this whole agenda through the business from the top, sort of sharing personal experiences, sharing, I suppose, from a leadership perspective, that idea of psychological safety you mentioned. It's okay to not be okay. How, I know you touched on it, but how have you and the exec team done that at Wesleyan?
So we're still on that journey. I think the exec team is started to build this culture from the top, and not all culture change has to start from the top. Indeed, I'd discourage it, but making sure the group executive team works in a certain way, is trusting of each other, shows a unified front to the business, just good leadership really, then goes down into our teams. So our senior leaders are currently going through the same training to give them that similar thing. So it's a rollout process. It's not something that can be just told, oh, by the way, we're going to be a psychologically safe organization now. Colleagues have to feel it. And so the thing that you need to do is minimize what I would call the credibility gap. So things that you say that you care about or are part of your culture versus things that people experience on the shop floor, you've got to do all you can to minimize that gap, because there'll be a lack of credibility for what you're saying if that is the case. And that's just about making people feel safe when they ask questions, raise concerns. And that, as I say, it's just a leadership behavior that people need to sort of get used to.
That's a really good point. And I think that point about leading, it doesn't have to be from the top. I think that's an important point. I'm conscious that not everyone, I'm sure we do have some like senior leaders and HR professionals watching today, but I'm conscious that not everyone necessarily will be a senior leader within their business. They might be a manager, or they might be just not a manager at all. They might just be interested in this agenda and sort of want to find out what their company could be doing to share it internally and see what is possible. So it's a really good point. Thank you.
I would just quickly say on that, if you are in a position that you don't own this agenda and you're a participant in, and I've seen a couple of questions that I'm sure we'll get to, Emily, one of which talks about freelancers who aren't necessarily part of an organization. I think if you're just looking at what you can do, I think it would be, along with other things, do some reading, some research, look into some of the topics we've talked about today, help develop your own resilience. Clearly, you could offer to be a mental health first aider, potentially, or you could just talk to your HR business partner or whoever the most senior people person is in your business, because I guarantee you they are thinking about this, losing sleep over this topic, and would welcome help, support, guidance, feedback, because you don't get into this profession to want to try and do it on your own. You share and you try and find the right result. So if you can't control it, talk to someone who can, because they'll no doubt want some help.
Fantastic, thank you. So speaking of that question that we've had in the Q&A, so this is for both of you really, what resilience support can be provided to those working as freelancers and independent professionals? Is there a role for representative bodies like the Chamber of Commerce to create a community of freelancers in the region and support network? Would individuals pay a subscription fee for something like this?
I'm going to defer to Phil in the first instance, if he's all right. As a corporate guy, I haven't come across this problem. I've got a view, but Phil may have a better view of what's out there.
Thanks, Nathan. I was going to pass this back to Emily to answer, but I think that It's a very good point. What do we
Yeah,
do
very good.
for the small employer, or for the employer with 3 people, or just the self-employed? There are, for example, in BHSF, we are able to provide those services to individuals. We tend to work with corporates, but not exclusively. And many of our customers are very small businesses. And we're delighted to engage with anybody. And it's the same in occupational health. We will take referrals from 2-person businesses. Funny, I've had a rich lifetime of experiences. I once did a medical on a twin brother whose twin brother referred him for a medical. And there was only 2 of them in the organization. They ran the business, but one twin brother referred the other for an occupational health consultation, and brought him to the consultation, and then came in afterwards and said to me, well, what's wrong with him? And I said, well, I can't tell you that, because of patient confidentiality. He said, well, he's going to tell me in the car on the way home. And I said, that's okay. He's entitled to do that. And that was one of the most bizarre, a 2-person business, both of whom were twin brothers. But you still actually can provide a service. It doesn't need to be I'm sure Nathan would agree. It doesn't need to be a head count of 1,000 or 10,000. It can be 1. I think there are a number of providers to Tom, who asked the question, whom you can access these services as an individual. I haven't, to the best of my knowledge, come across a collective body that one can subscribe to, but maybe that is something that an organization like the Chamber, Emily, would consider, which is an umbrella body.
Yeah, I think so. Really, sorry, no, over to you, Nathan.
No, I was going to say, I would agree. And just before I hand over to you, Emily, the other option are things like, I'm a member of the CIPD and the CIPR. I am getting regular communications from them about this. So for 140, 50 quid a year, registering with the closest existing body to your profession may provide you access to materials that you otherwise wouldn't get. But I, like Phil, was going to hand over to Emily and think, activities like this are exactly a start. It's just how do people access it afterwards?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, with Growth Through People as an example, which this is obviously part of, we're recording this webinar as an example. It'll be on our YouTube channel later. We have blogs, podcasts, videos on, well, this week in particular, harnessing resilience. Appreciating that it's a big theme and an important theme for this year. So there are sort of materials that will be available outside of March, which is when the campaign takes place. I think it's an interesting idea. We work very closely with CIPD. The example that Nathan gave of sort of working with your industry body, if you have one, I appreciate not every industry does, is possibly an idea. We also had a webinar, I think it was last week or the week before, where someone was speaking about they work in the creative sector with a lot of freelancers. So they head up a small business, and they work with a number of freelancers as well. And they were saying that actually working from home has sort of, with everyone working from home, has sort of embedded the freelancers more in their culture, because previously they were in an office and it felt more like sort of everyone in the office, that was the team. And freelancers are the people who just sort of occasionally come and go, like of them, but you don't really know them that well. But they were saying that actually the way that they've been working from home, they've managed to sort of integrate the freelancers that they work with regularly into the culture of their business. So I think that's an interesting idea. I wonder if remote working has a role to play in that. I'm not sure necessarily, how entitlements and access to various support through the business necessarily works in that case, but that also could be a potential idea in regards to that. I think it is a very important point, making sure that those freelancers who, we all talk about lone working at the moment, but freelancers very much are out on their own. So I appreciate it's an important point. That leads on, I was gonna ask this at the end actually, but Phil, for those experiencing mental health difficulties who maybe don't know where to go, whether it's related to their employment or otherwise, where should they be looking for support?
and this is within their organization, Emily? Is that what you're
or
referring to?
otherwise?
Well, I mean, the first, I mean, I would always advise people to evaluate the internal options that they have with their employer. You would be surprised to hear that many people, because they've never accessed or needed these services, aren't necessarily aware of what's available in their own employer. So I think a conversation with your line manager, Nathan quite rightly pointed out, the line manager is key, or managers are key here. So I think, a conversation with your manager, which costs absolutely nothing, to evaluate what the organization has in place or might be prepared to consider, because there's a lot of flexibility at the minute. So if somebody now says to the manager, look, I've got some issues, I wouldn't mind some support, they may not have it in place, Emily, but they certainly might have the capability to access it, or to allow the individual to access it. I mean, a plea for my beleaguered GP: please don't contact your GP. Because they simply are absolutely overwhelmed, and it's such a difficult scenario, as is the NHS. So I think we've got to be pragmatic. We've got to look for private resources to deal with this. And my first recommendation is always to go through your manager and see what your organization has in place or could put in place. Many organizations today are quite flexible, and they will say, look, we have an association, we recommend. You talked about, Emily, a close working with the CIPD, etc. There are lots of organizations out there who can support individuals as and when. So I think that probably would be my suggested sensible option. I don't know if you agree, Nathan.
No, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Nothing more to add.
Fantastic, thank you. Nathan, you mentioned in your slides, and you briefly touched upon the idea of something called the sanctuary, and having a place for people to, I've spoken to colleagues at Wesley, and it can be sort of anything that you need it to be. With this idea of sort of working from home, something that we've come across anecdotally with the businesses that we speak to is people not feeling like they're able to take breaks. And I know you mentioned that in regards to holiday, but I mean more so in the sense of day to day, not feeling like you can step away from the computer, because there's always something, there's always a Teams call, there's always that notification that we all know at this point, that Teams noise of a message coming through. How can you encourage people to feel like they can step away for a moment, or for lunch, like a genuine lunch break?
It's a really good question, and I'm literally the worst person to ask. I go back to back most days. No, being serious, I think it's culture. Okay, it's culture, and because it's easy for people to just drop meetings in, and you look at it come through, and you go, well, yeah, I probably should be at that. They want to chat to me about something. You just accept them blindly. You accept them at an hour length. You accept them when they butt up against another one. And I think considering we're doing it for a year, I don't think we've got all that great at managing that well. So we, in the next week actually, we're launching a meeting and email charter, probably 6 months too late. But we've learned from the data that we've seen and the behaviors that we've seen where our problems are, and we are going to try and start to encourage a different way of doing things. So 45 minutes or 20 minutes being sort of more default than 30 in an hour, giving people time to refresh drinks and comfort breaks and whatnot. Trying to remove reply all from our repertoire as best we can, and just various bits and pieces that will corporately help to shrink the problem. But I'll be really honest, a lot of it comes down to the individual and them feeling okay to do so and saying no. And I think at the moment it's been best endeavors, almost a bit of crisis. Let's just all muck in and get through this. And I don't think we've taken a step back and gone, I'm in control here. I mean, prior to the pandemic, very rarely took a long lunch break. I'd prefer to work through so I could get back at a decent time, see my kids before bed and whatever. That was a personal choice. It wasn't particularly healthy. It was what it was. But now I've blocked out 30 minutes in my diary every day to have a proper away from the screen lunch. Otherwise, my eyes just melt, right? And I've really benefited from it. No one's batted an eyelid. Similarly, on a Monday and Tuesday, I take my kids to school, which means I'm not on at the normal sort of start time. No one's batted an eyelid. I put it in my diary. I just do it, and it's fine. I think people have got to sort of take control of their own diary, take control of their own time, start asking for reductions in meeting times, doing what they can. And if it's still a problem, then it is a cultural problem that you've got to flag through leadership. But we all have a role to play in that, I think, as a starting point.
Could I add to that?
Yeah,
I
absolutely
agree with that. But I think laughter is the best medicine, Nathan. And for people who know me well, they know that sometimes people have said, Phil, you're really a comedian with a medical degree. I think it's about engendering that fun element, because one of the classic symptoms of mental health problems is a lack of pleasure or the inability to see humor or have fun, and that's really disabling. So conversely, for those people who need a bit of a boost, let's have some fun. So we do a lot of that. I mean, I have 7 direct reports and I speak to them all the time, but at least once a week we have a conversation which is just entitled fun. And because I'm really into food, the first thing I asked them was, what did you cook last night? And we talk about food, and I noticed you've got the HelloFresh recipes, Nathan, which is great, on the Wesleyan, and absolutely. And I'm doing a live cooking for our staff on the 30th of March. I've got 15 minutes. So this is we have a Slack channel, which is a what they call a water cooler banter channel. And we run quizzes all the time, or what's your favorite film, and everybody chips in. It's really very good. So they asked me to do a live cooking. I've put up 3 recipes. Everybody voted for their choice, and I've got 15 minutes to cook it on Zoom, and everybody's going to cook it with me, and we're just going to have a laugh.
Wow.
And we had the Christmas quiz, and everybody seemed to get immense enjoyment out of the fact that I came last in the Christmas quiz. And because I would be the oldest on the call, they said, here's a question more relevant to you, Phil. When was Stonehenge built? And it's about having that element of fun. The impact is phenomenal. It's absolutely phenomenal. So, let's make our staff laugh. Let's engage with them and give them that sense of fun. And it's worth its weight in gold. I don't know if you agree, Nathan, but
Yeah, we are missing human interaction. I certainly get a lot of energy from it, and I'll also admit my leadership style hasn't. I didn't feel translated as well to a screen-based relationship. I like being in the office. I like spotting signs. I like tapping someone on the shoulder and saying, "Do you want to grab 5 minutes?" All of these things that we've all got used to over however long your career is. They're common cues, and we're missing them. I often describe lockdown working as work just without the upside, because you're getting the work done. It's a similar work to what you were doing before, but you're just missing the fun bits, the walk to and from the meetings, the water cooler stuff. I noticed from my diary, Emily, I think it's meant to be the chamber dinner this week. That was always a nice thing to look forward to meet the wider business community and people that you speak to on these sorts of things. So yeah, it will come back, but the hybrid working will be interesting. People will choose to stay away and whatnot. We just have to do things like Phil's just described. I'm not quite sure I want to cook in front of my colleagues. I might lose any credibility I've got, but I'll find something else to do. That definitely sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, if it's helpful, at the chamber, I know we're doing bingo, where we've got a few members of staff and one of our chamber presidents who is a stand-up comedian. So we're having them do the bingo calling. I've never done bingo before, but it's very cheap if anyone's interested in a cheap option. Brilliant, thank you both. I'll finish on that as I'm conscious of time, and that was a really nice positive note to finish on. I just want to say a huge thank you once again to our sponsors, Aston University, BMET College, and the University of Birmingham's Work Inclusivity Research Centre. And a massive thank you to both of you for your time and expertise. I think it's fantastic discussion, some really, really good practical ideas, and great to hear that clinical side as well from Phil. We have one final Growth Through People workshop coming up. That's tomorrow. On Leading for Growth with Anne Clues and Stuart Bailey from Curium Solutions. So shifting that mindset from sort of survival mode, which I think a lot of us have been in throughout the pandemic, to beyond the pandemic and leading for growth again. We've also got the Growth People Conference a week from today. We've got some fantastic keynote speakers, Baroness Ruby Madreda Smith, CBE, who is currently president of the British Chambers of Commerce, a senior business leader and a member of the House of Lords, and Jess Phillips MP, who you may be aware of as a local MP for Birmingham Yardley and a 2-time best-selling author. So that's on Tuesday next week, and it's free for anyone to attend. If you can, then complete our post-event survey. It would be hugely appreciated. And just want to say thank you for joining us, and thank you to Philip and Nathan for sharing their expertise in the session. Thank you.
Thank you everybody for listening.
Cheers all.
Thanks Nathan.
Bye-bye.